In 1991, Paul Gleason wrote a paper titled LCES and Other Thoughts. Drawing from a long firefighting career that started in 1964 and included working as a hotshot supervisor and district and regional FMO, his paper introduced the concept of lookouts, communications, escape routes, and safety zones as an interconnected system. It has since become the cornerstone for wildland firefighter safety and inspired another generation of firefighters. Brad Mayhew is one of those firefighters and has been analyzing LCES and how we use it.
So LCES, I love LCES, right? In the wildland firefighting profession, just a ton of lists. We got more lists sometimes than we know what to do with, and actually they all have a use and a place for us. But if there's one list that we count on, that we trust, it's LCES. Why? Because those are the 4 key safety measures for avoiding entrapment and burnover in the wildland context. Right? We trust LCES. We trust that if I have my LCES covered, if I have my LCES in place, I'm going to be able, even if this fire, everything goes to hell in a handbasket, I'm going to be able to get out of danger and get to safety, and at least I have my safety measures covered. I know that for the experienced firefighters, that is already intuitive, ingrained. It goes without saying, but I'm telling you, for a lot of folks, there's times where we do LCES without even thinking about fire behavior. So if we could underline this as many times as possible, LCES doesn't make any sense if it's not based on fire behavior. But more than that, LCES has to be based on the fire potential, has to be based on the worst case fire potential. In other words, I need a safety zone that's going to be adequate. A safety zone is going to do the job if the fire does its worst. This is a key pitfall at LCES, right, is forgetting about change, right? Fire is dynamic. Fire is constantly changing. Wind is constantly changing. The location of the sun is constantly changing. My location relative to the safety zone is constantly changing. We're in an environment that is constantly changing, constantly dynamic, but it's a very common pitfall to use LCES in a way that's not dynamic. I call it set it and forget it syndrome, right? Where I said, I checked those things off. If the safety zone was there at 10 a.m., I guarantee you that thing is still there at 1600 hours, right? So the question isn't, is it there? The question is it still adequate? Is it still going to be enough? Based on conditions now and how conditions might be changing, is this thing still going to work for me? Dynamic fire behavior means dynamic safety measures. Dynamic fire potential, I need dynamic LCES. I think one of the very useful things about approaching LCES in this way, based on the intent of LCES and based on fire potential, is it gives you a way of defining the components of LCES in a very useful way. Take lookouts, for example. If you ask firefighters what's the definition of a lookout, what does it take to have a good lookout, you're going to get all kinds of answers. Do lookouts have to be on high spots, low spots, see the whole fire, see how much experience, can they have collateral duties? There's all these factors, right? And it becomes pretty tricky to try to nail down exactly what it takes to have a good lookout for this situation and for every situation. Well, with this approach, it gives you a way, I think it gives you a way of doing it. Because what it allows you to do is it allows you to say, look, with this approach to LCES, what is the fundamental intent of a lookout? The fundamental intent of a lookout is someone who's going to see the early warning signs, recognize them, and be able to get the word to me in enough time for me to get to safety. What's the intent of the C in LCES? And one piece of that is when it's time to pull the trigger and get to the safety zone, I'm confident that there is a line of communication from my lookout directly to me and that the word's going to get from him or her to me in enough time for me to get to safety. That's one part of communication in LCES. The other piece of it, too, has to do with making sure that I'm getting and sharing key info about fire potential, about changing conditions, so that as I'm noticing these key indicators, I'm not just keeping them to myself, but I'm making that information available to the folks around me, so that they're using that to update their essay, and they're recognizing the changes as well. How many of us do this, right? Where we go, do I have a way out of here? And you look at that little deer trail and you go, yeah, I got a route. Check, right? The real issue is, if this fire starts cooking, if this thing starts doing its worst, is that escape route going to be adequate for me? And in some situations, a 30-second escape route isn't going to be adequate, right? Because a fire can get to you faster than you can get away from it. If I look at the fire potential in my best judgment, right, and I look at my LCS in my best judgment, I make the judgment call that, look, based on what this fire is capable of, each element of my LCS is adequate. If this fire does its worst, I'm going to be able to get myself and my people I'm responsible for, I'm going to be able to get us to safety. What that means is what? I can engage confidently. I'm still going to need to keep updating my essay. I'm still going to want to keep questioning, looking if something's changing. But you can have a 3-hour escape route uphill with all kinds of gnarly stuff. You can have a 3-day escape route, as long as that escape route is adequate based on the worst case fire behavior. If it's adequate, it's adequate. It's a judgment call. Human beings are not going to make perfect judgments, right? But there's no substitute for our subjective human judgment. What's the definition of a safety zone? How big does it need to be? Where does it need to be located? I don't know how you define that objectively. The only way to define a safety zone has to involve some element of human judgment, right? It is a judgment call to some degree. So let's define what that means. The issue with a safety zone has to be this. Based on what this fire is capable of, am I confident that this spot is going to be adequate, that we're going to be all right in there if this fire does what it's actually capable of doing today? It's not something that I do for OSHA. It's not something I do for the chiefs. It's not something for the guys in City Hall or the state capitol or even in Washington. We don't do LCES for them, right? We do LCES for us. LCES is for me, to avoid me getting burned and the other people that are with me. It's for us to avoid getting burned.
Ivan Poppolitti is a human performance specialist with the U.S. Forest Service. He is a longtime lead plane pilot with a strong background in accident investigation, both on the aviation side and the ground firefighter side. Ivan describes what he calls the gap. The gap is a comparison between how work is designed or structured from a management perspective, like the IRPG and Fireline Handbook, for example, compared to how the work is actually performed by firefighters on the ground in the thick of action. There is always a gap. There will always be a gap. He identifies this gap as an obstacle in communicating with firefighters about their experiences that led to unfavorable outcomes. In this module, we'll discuss some of the reasons why this creates problems from an accident prevention side and the steps that are being taken to promote discussion between fire safety managers and operational firefighters.
What is an accident? An accident is an unforeseen and unplanned event or circumstance. If we're looking at something that was not planned and not intended, why do we do accident investigation? The reason that we do it is for prevention. Because if we're really looking at prevention, the thing that we should be doing is simply looking for lessons learned out of these things so that they can be avoided. So we can describe the gap in greater detail as a result of this adverse outcome. So accident investigations came up with things like failure to follow policy and procedures. And in the Dude Fire, we came up with failure to follow the 10 standard firefighting orders, and that became the groundwork for us to take a look at our accidents in terms of the 10 standard firefighting orders.
So what we ended up with was a blame and train cycle. This situation then identified human error as the cause of the accident, and individuals were either counseled or disciplined. This led to less trust and less communication. The gap between management and firefighters was widening, and the problems or conditions that supported the accident were still there.
We can go back in and we can make a story out of what happened that makes complete sense. And sadly, in human related and human performance related adverse outcomes or accidents, sometimes it doesn't make sense.
It takes courage to talk about an accident that may be perceived as a mistake. A prideful culture doesn't take lightly what may be viewed as an embarrassing situation, especially in fire culture. But steps are being taken to develop systems that reward firefighters who tell their story. Fire leadership training emphasizes sharing experiences and as a way to improve decision-making, improve overall performance, and break down this communication gap.
We can observe things in a mechanical sense. We can take things to the laboratory and we can dissect them and take them down to their lowest component. But as we start to do this with human judgment, it becomes more and more difficult. We can't really break human judgment down into component parts because no two people fail at exactly the same point. If I put you in a circumstance and I put myself in a circumstance, we would fail at a different point, even though the circumstances were the same. And in fact, if I were in the same circumstance over and over and over again, I wouldn't fail at the same point because I would have learned from my experience. And this is very important. This is called heuristics.
How much risk will you accept in the pursuit of your fire line objectives? Your experience and judgment will determine the course of action you choose. There will always be an opportunity cost. If we spend more time on the process, what does it cost us in the final outcome?
This goes back to pressures of effectiveness, thoroughness trade-off. If we look at the 10 standard firefighting orders, for example, and we look at number 10, fight fire aggressively, having provided for safety first. This is a complete effectiveness, thoroughness trade-off. Because if we want to be completely effective at fighting the fire, we're going to be aggressive. But if we're going to be completely thorough, we're going to be completely safe. How can you be both completely safe and completely effective? What we're asking our people to do is use their judgment to come to some middle ground of application of this standard firefighting order, to understand that, or to develop a way of implementing this philosophy that they have to make some sort of effectiveness, thoroughness trade-off. Now, our desire is that they make that trade-off on the basis of safety. What is normal or standard? Because we have to compare, if we're going to say that somebody did something wrong, we have to compare that against something which is right. So what is normal and standard? Is that well defined? How far is below, for example? And was the rule clear or conflicted is where we really should be going. Most of these things avoid the question of why did these actions or these decisions make sense to the individual at the time. How many people think that Sully Sullenberg, the pilot of the airplane that crashed on the Hudson, was a hero? Most people feel that he was a hero. But let me submit something to you. If he had done exactly the same thing, and there had been a rogue wave, a helicopter that took off from the helispot that's right near where he landed, there had been a ferry that went across the Hudson River that he impacted. If that had happened, he would be considered a villain for doing exactly the same thing that he did, for which he's now considered to be a hero. That's categorically unfair. It's unfair to vilify people, and it's unfair to prop them up as heroes. And if you listen to the speeches that Sullenberg is doing now, he doesn't claim to be a hero. He claims to be a pilot who is doing his job, doing the best that he could with a bad situation. The truth is that people create safety in a very unsafe world. That people, through naturalistic decision-making, through heuristics, through taking action when they perceive that they're going down a dangerous path, they actually create safety. It's not that the world is safe and there's a bad person doing a bad thing, we pluck them out, put a good person in. The truth is, the world is unsafe, and the people within our world create safety. So this kind of brings this to a different perspective. The systems view starts to take a more holistic approach to the entire accident scenario. And instead of focusing so much on what happened, it tries to understand why it happened. So instead of looking at things in terms of error, it looks at things instead in terms of what conditions supported error. And James Reason said that you cannot change the human condition, but you can change the conditions under which humans work. And this should be our goal. Our goal in management, in safety program management in particular, is to create a situation where our people are more likely to be successful. For individuals that are involved in circumstances, in operations, they have many dimensions of information that they're being bombarded with from many, many directions. They have to take this stimulus and process this stimulus and make decisions. These decisions result in courses of action. As each one of these decisions is made, The individual does not know the outcome. And it's very much like being in a tunnel. And most of the time, the tunnel ends up with a successful outcome. In fact, in our firefighting operations, about 98% of the time, we end up with a completely successful outcome. So the individual has an expectation as they're going through this maze or this tunnel that the outcome is going to be successful. In the 2% where we have problems, the accident investigators generally come back in and they look at that tunnel with very great clarity of hindsight. They can now look at each one of these decision points using their judgment, ascribe the word error to these decisions because they know the outcome. But for the individual who's involved in making those decisions, it's anything but clear. And most assuredly, if they knew that the outcome was going to be adverse, they wouldn't take the action. So for them, the clarity doesn't exist. And that's why it's really unfair to apply hindsight bias to these decisions and call them errors, having known the outcome. In fact, they're only errors knowing the outcome. And the more complex a situation is, the more error likely that situation becomes. The greater the possibilities are of having an error by adding more complexity. So there's a problem to this approach to the model. The other thing that can happen as a result of this linearity is that there's a lack of understanding of the 98% of the time that things are successful. In other words, 98% of the time, the individual recognizes the potential outcome, takes corrective action, and avoids that outcome. The individual should have that freedom to make that naturalistic determination of what they should do to avoid the potential conflict. They have to be able to see it to avoid it. They have to be able to react to it in order to avoid it. And that's not done through rules and regulations. That's done through heuristics and experience. And that's why we're 98% effective.
By now you're aware that our subject is weather. Weather related to forest fires. My name is Louis Allen, weather is my business, and my job is to get across to you the importance and the role that weather plays in the start and spread of forest fires.
The Weather Service provides forecasts on a number of scales to make sure that firefighters are getting the information they need, whatever type of incident they go on. The types of forecasts that we issue range from the daily forecast that's available every day, twice a day, to a specialized spot forecast if you're doing a prescribed burn or a wildfire that's just started, or an incident meteorologist can be on your fire, and they're a great resource for those things that you need to know about the weather. When you're out on a fire, you can experience a whole range of winds. You can experience the Groundhog Day effect of stagnant weather. Your incident action plan or your forecast says, okay, today is going to be like yesterday, not much change. Those are the types of verbal clues you're getting, that there's no real major weather system coming in that's going to change things. So what happens when you're out there and you're getting those verbal clues of, okay, today's going to be like yesterday, high pressure, not much change. You're actually looking for the convective winds. That's kind of a fancy, more technical term for when the sun hits a slope, it heats up, the air rises, and you start all these motions in place. And then when the sun sets, or it's not hitting on a slope, you don't have that radiation, so you're going to be a little bit cooler. And those little subtle temperature differences, they create wind. Up slope, up valley during the day, down slope, down valley at night. And that should be reflected in your IMET forecast or any spot forecast that you get. You're going to get squirrely winds. You're going to get things that are just a little bit different or in a different direction from what the IMET or that forecast has for your area. But generally they should be relatively accurate, those winds. So on a persistent day where you're heating up during the day, it's a nice clear day, no major fronts, no big cumulus buildups, you can't expect those terrain-induced upslope, downslope type of winds. The second type of wind that you can get during the afternoon especially is called mixdown. When the sun starts to heat up the atmosphere, sometimes you'll hear it at your IAP briefing, we're going to have mixdown winds, or the inversion is going to break between 1300 and 1500 today. You have that mixing that occurs, and you have all the winds that are a little bit stronger above the mixing depth. And then as that inversion level breaks, all that momentum, all that oomph, all that push from the upper level winds can mix down to the surface. So what you're looking for out in the field to clue you in that that could be an important part of the wind equation that day is to listen to your IMET inversion level breaking, or we're going to have some stronger winds this afternoon, or expect the inversion to break at 1330 today. That's a clue that those types of winds can kick in.
A gradient wind is named because of the gradient that exists between a high and a low pressure system.
In the summertime, those changes may not be accompanied by rain, especially in the west. So you're looking for terms such as dry cold frontal passage today, or weak cold front, or trough, low pressure. All those kind of signal gradient wind day. It's very tricky to assess how much of that gradient wind is actually going to be experienced on the fire line. If the storm or the front is powerful enough, those winds can surface, and they can take what is typically an upslope, downslope wind and drive it in the opposite direction. And then the last one, which is extremely important, is if you get those cumulus buildups, if you get a regular thunderstorm out there, you can have convective or thunderstorm winds. They can be very erratic, they can be very gusty, they're critically important. So if you're out there and you're noticing thunderstorms develop, or even moderately, it doesn't even have to be raining or thundering, moderate buildups, big, puffy, beautiful clouds, might not be so beautiful on the line because they can induce some winds. Your standard cumulus buildup will give you a 30 to 40 mile per hour wind that wasn't there, and it'll come out of nowhere. The big thunderstorms, they can really, really cause some havoc because you can get 50 to even 80 mile an hour downburst dry winds out of those things. If you're lucky enough to have an incident meteorologist on your fire, you have the capability of having a localized IAP forecast or briefing. What's not going to be in that forecast is the exact weather at the exact time and moment where you're going to be on a specific division fighting the fire. Even though the forecast is designed for that specific spot, your IAP and your briefing is still going to be a more generalized type of briefing or piece of information. So when an IMET gives you that forecast, we're giving you a yardstick. We're giving you that, even though it's a yard, it's pretty specialized for your fire. The type of weather you're going to be seeing at the incident is going to be measured in inches and not the yard. Those inches are where your personal judgment comes into play. Are embers drifting up into the air instead of sideways? Are the winds starting to pick up? What are the tops of the trees doing? Are they swaying back and forth? Those types of clues that should give you a kind of an instant brief snapshot, in addition to what the IMET gives you, that things are developing, things are changing, things are happening at that time of day. So what an IMET can't do is to give you that momentary snapshot where you are at that particular moment, the exact weather conditions where you're standing. You should have a 90% idea, but that 10% has to be filled in by your training, by your awareness, and by your situational awareness of the surrounding area. When you're out on the line and you're in canopy, you can pick up on some visual clues of how the winds are changing. If it's the morning, you can kind of take a look. You can look up in the sky to see if there's any cumulus clouds or any visual indicators of instability. If your atmosphere is absolutely clear, that can be also an indicator of instability. If you have little puffy, sheep-like looking clouds, they're actually called flockus clouds, a flock of sheep. You can remember it that way. If it looks like there's a bunch of sheep at 9 in the morning up there, it's unstable. And you can kind of expect that vertical movement of the wind later in the afternoon, or maybe even thunderstorm development, dry thunderstorm development. So what can you do as a firefighter to key in on these winds? First of all, listen to your forecast. Listen for the term unstable today or high haines today. That's the first clue. And you can combine that when you go out on the ground with your visual indicators. Smoke can actually inhibit winds. It can block out the sun so much that you're not going to get the convective winds. It's going to be very kind of a surreal, strange, you're in smoke and nothing's happening and you expect something to go, but it's so thick that nothing happens. But if you're in a run-of-the-mill fire where it's relatively clear, it's the afternoon and you start seeing that smoke, instead of spreading out horizontally and creating that layer, if the visibility starts to improve suddenly, if you see smoke getting up higher into the atmosphere, if you see it, punching through above the tree line and starting to bubble up, again, indicator that the cap is broken, that those winds could surface in a matter of 30 minutes or even 15 minutes. So watching smoke is vital. It can clue you in on when the inversion's breaking. You could get spotting in the direction of where that smoke is going, if there are active embers that are floating up into the column. So it's a great indicator. It's using that side effect of the fire to determine what your winds are doing. Feedback from the field is critical to performance, and just because a forecast doesn't work one day, doesn't mean that you're not going to get quality, good forecasts later on. And those quality forecasts are only generated when we receive information back of how well we're doing. And if you don't give the data back, we don't know what's happening. And we can't build the database to improve the forecast, not only for now, but 10 years down the line. If you go back to that area, we have a weather record for that area. So not only are you helping your forecast by helping us finding out how we're actually doing, you're building a legacy of making sure that future firefighters are protected from better forecasts from that data that you're giving us. Fire weather forecasts are designed to make sure that you are safe. And you can't be safe unless you have a little bit of err on the side of caution. We have a tendency to overwarn and overpredict for a purpose. And that purpose is to capture bad events and not miss them. And that results in some false alarms. It's better for us to overwarn and overdo it in terms of safety than to underdo the forecast. And then somebody says, that wind shift was unexpected. We didn't have it in the forecast. It wasn't there. Well, it should be there. We strive for it to be there, and it's a safety issue.
In the final analysis, however, you must add your own knowledge and understanding of fire behavior. As fire control men, the weather indeed is a very important part of your business.
The purpose of this module is to basically emphasize for each and every firefighter that they are fire behavior specialists out on the ground. We want to encourage people to go back to those basic assessments that we have taught them through 190 and 290 and 390 and 490, It's a basic preface there that people have the skills to make fire behavior predictions when they're out on the line.
Believe me, I'm certainly glad I went to that fire school with my neighbors last week. It's a mighty good training session. It prepared us to help one another in case we got a fire. We learned that a few men can handle a lot of fire when they're trained. You know, I believe I'll never forget that fire school. We learned that it took a combination of air, heat, and fuel to make a fire burn. This is the combustion triangle. Remove any one of these elements and the fire goes out. Remove the fuel side, the triangle is broken and the fire goes out. Remove the heat side, it is broken, the fire goes out. Remove the air side and the fire goes out.
The fire behavior basics are fire behavior triangle. It's fuels, weather, and topography. So when you as a firefighter are going out there, whether you're going out on an initial attack fire or you're going out to a large-scale incident or you're going out to do a burn, you need to be paying attention to, okay, well, what's the weather? What's it been? How is it going to affect my operations today and potentially tomorrow? And what are the fuels set up to be? Are you doing a prescribed burn maybe against some of the snowpack? Are you doing a burn when your fuel moistures are low but expecting your weather to help compensate some of that? Everybody should be going back reviewing the fundamentals. The higher up you go in the food chain, most people, it's very easy to lose the basics. And I think a lot of times when we're in those higher echelon positions, it's like you forget what it's like to be on the ground. And so I think that to bring people back and say, no, this is how it's happening on the ground. We need to review this information. So it's the beginning of the fire season, and there is a lot of information out there that we can collect that can give us the baseline information to tie it to the fire behavior triangle. And there is the old saying that only fools predict a fire season, but I think there's some elements there that can really help preface the upcoming season, whether it's what the fuels are sitting at based on what was the snowpack, how much moisture received in the spring, maybe how your fuels were burning when you were doing your spring burning program, how's the weather setting up, is there a certain geographical area that's starting to see fire season starting earlier. So I've created a baseline of information pre-season, and now I'm out on the fire line, and I'm walking the line, and I'm seeing that the fuels are stressed. The leaves are starting to curl. The colors are starting to change. It looks like it's fall, but it's July. Those are some of the things I'm putting in my mind. Or if I do a moisture probe, and I look at some of the larger fuels, and they're single digits already. Or I'm kicking the dirt and kicking away rotted logs, and there's no moisture left in them. You're looking at your current fire behavior and you make an assessment. Are your lookouts in the right place? Do they need to be moved? What's your communication based on your current fire behavior and what you're seeing and what you're expected based on what you've picked up from your data gathering or your assessment period? Are your escape routes and safety zones, are they adequate? So what does all this information mean now that we've gathered out on the line? What it means is you have validated your LCES and now you are ready for your tactical operations for the day.
Don's crew was wasting a lot of energy trying to knock the fire out of a big bush. He had them use an indirect attack. They backed up and made the line where the fuel was light. They threw extra fuel out of the way. Then they burned out the fuel between their line and the fire. This burning out is another way to remove the fuel leg of the triangle.
We all need to be responsible for our own actions out on the fire line. We can't be dependent on somebody else to always take care of us. And so that comes to the basics that we need to be paying attention to as far as the fire behavior triangle and how is that going to impact us. We need to have a really good understanding of what's the fuels, weather, and topography. And until we have those elements, we're not going to be able to implement or successfully implement tactical operations until we have our situational awareness of the fire behavior and what's going to happen with the fire behavior. You got to constantly be keeping yourself abreast of the situation. That's the art. You've got the hard science side of fire behavior that, yeah, you can have all these models spew out numbers and it's black and white, but until you're actually on the ground, walking it, looking at it, assessing and reevaluating, does those numbers mean anything? That's the art. So you have the hard science and you have the art side of fire behavior. Feedback is really important in order to have adequate fire behavior predictions. Whether you're on an initial attack fire and you're providing feedback to your local FMO, or you're providing feedback to a fire behavior analyst or an incident meteorologist. And the feedback is, when you're out on the line and you're working in Division Alpha for a week, you are the fire behavior specialist for that particular piece of line. You know what's been happening, you know the local wind events, you know the little anomalies that have been happening every day. I can guarantee your weather observations or your weather forecasts will be a lot better if you can provide that incident meteorologist some information from the ground to help them get up to speed. Same with the fire behavior analyst. If you provide them feedback, it will only make their forecast that much better. So one of the things that I want to make sure that we include is making sure that people take the time out to take the weather throughout the event, whether it's on the hour or every half hour. It really gives people that time to raise their head, gather their situational awareness, take a breather, look around, what's changing, is there something that needs to be readjusted based on the information they're gathering when they take the weather. So many times we get so focused on getting from point A to point B, just putting in line and putting our heads down and digging, we forget to raise our heads and really look around and look at the changing conditions. And I think that's really important. That's something that we really need to encourage people to do.